There's Stefan as well. There you go. So yeah, let's start with today's seminar, and welcome everyone to another MSDI research seminar series. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. So in this seminar series, we aim to foster interdisciplinary conversations related to sustainable development challenges. And our speaker today is a perfect fit for that seminar series. I'm very pleased to introduce Adrian Smith, our speaker of today. So Adrian is a research professor at the Science Policy Research Unit, or SPRU, at the University of Sussex in the UK. And generally speaking, I would say your work has covered broadly the topics of politics and governance of innovation, and particularly in the context of sustainability and sustainable development. Many of us will know your work on grassroots innovation, which is a major program of work that you carried out across a number of internationally funded research projects. And that is also available in a book that you published with Routledge in 2017. You've also been a major contributor to literature on niche development, niche innovation, and experimentation, and I'm really had the pleasure to work with you in a couple of those projects, which is still a great memory to me. But today you will turn your, I guess, your insights and expertise to look critically at automation and the fourth industrial revolution as a dominant narrative in that process, but also point towards an alternative narrative and practice, which you call post-automation. And I'm really pleased that you accepted the invitation to speak here, Adrian, and the floor is yours.
Great, many thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for joining. I know it's the end of the working day there, so I'm really grateful to you all for sticking around. And yeah, let me just share my screen and get the slides up, and then we can begin. So just do that and minimize that. So what I'm going to talk about, I mean, it draws on, it's not a specific research project or results I'm reporting. It's more just some thoughts that draw upon a variety of research projects, actually including one that was in collaboration with Rob some time ago around smart urbanism and looking at some of the kind of bottom-up initiatives in digital urbanism. And it was born of, if you like, two things. This what I'm talking about is some thoughts that I've developed with my colleague Mariano Fresoli at the Universidad Nacional de San Martin in Buenos Aires, and it was born of a bit of disappointment, well, not disappointment, maybe frustration with some of the kind of public discussions around the new wave of automation that's upon us, and the sort of technological determinism that sort of underlies some of that debate. And then also just sort of reflections we're having on a variety of projects under this work around grassroots innovation, looking at, if you like, initiatives where people were almost taking some of the similar technologies that are normally associated with automation and putting them to quite different purposes, actually, and not automating so much. And then we just thought, well, maybe that's is that a form of post-automation? And so, oh, that's a neat word. What might it mean? And so this is us trying to fill that out, if you like, for now. And what I'm going to talk about will be coming out in a paper in the journal Futures soon, hopefully. It's just been accepted for publication. But it's still very much work in progress, and I welcome, questions, comments, feedbacks, telling us where we might be going wrong or misconceiving things, where it might be useful to develop things further, etc. So thanks for your attention, all of that. This is the kind of how I want to run through the next sort of 30, 40 minutes. I'll start off by introducing how we sort of understand automation initially, a very kind of high level kind of approach to it, if you like, what automation theory means. And before turning to some work that kind of criticizes that a bit or questions the sort of future, what Caspar Scholling calls the future essentialism in some of this automation discourse as presented within the broader kind of discourse of the fourth industrial revolution. That obviously many countries, sectors, and universities are investing in. Then I'm going to try and turn to this idea of post-automation with some examples from our research, if you like, of people sort of subverting and appropriating some of the technological ingredients of automation. And as I say, putting them to different purposes and try and abstract from that some sort of broad features of what capabilities for doing post-automation enable, if you like, recognizing that actually there's a risk there to kind of try and encapsulate a lot of diversity across very different situations into some overarching kind of term or concept. And then I'll finish by some thoughts on the sort of politics of post-automation, how these capabilities might circulate, and seeing that as a kind of political endeavor. So that's the plan. Automation, or theory of automation, is really about adapting societies, we say, to kind of quite preconceived ideas about technologies. And I sort of thought it'd be useful to begin with a quote about what automation is, a sort of definition that was given by the engineer Leon Bagrit in a public discussion on the BBC, the Reef Lectures that are held each year in 1964. And his lecture series was called The Age of Automation. And he defined automation as a concept through which a machine system is caused to operate with maximum efficiency by means of adequate measurement, observation, and control of its behavior. It involves a detailed and continuous knowledge of the functioning of the system so that the best corrective actions can be applied immediately they become necessary. Now, since then, obviously, when automation was sort of being conceived as entering into workplaces and the home, and continues to do so, you could think about smart homes and smart electricity, for example. And indeed, actually, that's an example of how also automation is being conceived and applied much widely to energy systems, to cities through smart urbanism, to global production and consumption networks, to agriculture through Agriculture 4.0, etc., and so on and so forth, being applied to warfare, to public administration, and so forth. And the idea is, you're taking these technological affordances of computation, communication, and control, and applying them and automating various sort of activities and functions in these different sectors and places. With the fourth industrial revolution discourse, combining some of these digital capabilities with advances in material sciences and the biosciences and so forth, as some of the sort of foundations driving this automation arguably are the imperatives to boost labour productivity, to promote a new wave of capital accumulation, and to enhance managerial control over systems, over production, including managerial control over our relationships with natures, with environmental resources, sinks, and services. Interestingly, on the political left, there's been some quite provocative debate and ideas for what's been coined fully automated luxury communism. And they're arguing there as a way of trying to, resuscitate, re-energize sort of left thinking, arguing that automation should not only be embraced, but accelerated and pushed beyond the kind of the forms and extent to which it might be promoted under the fourth industrial revolution, and taken even further. So we get this material abundance. And using the productivity of automation to underpin the provision of universal basic services and income, a kind of post-scarcity technology acceleration as goods and services become increasingly cheap and abundant, and that's all socialized through forms of state control, and that this fully automated luxury communism and automation accelerated in this way actually will force us to reconceive what we mean about work and labor and modern societies. Okay, so they see very much social revolutionary potential in automation. And again, as with the fourth industrial revolution, when it comes to things like sustainable development, the emphasis is on, ecological modernization of these cyber physical systems. So kind of left and right, if you like, there's a kind of embracing of automation and figuring out how to adapt societies to make best advantage of these technological capabilities. And this is just a brief slide to point out that this isn't new necessarily. Back in 1964, there was the Triple Revolution Committee led by Nobel Prize-winning Linus Pauling and other kind of thinkers, looking into the issue of basic incomes because of the forthcoming cyber nation, as they were calling it then, this sort of implementations of automations and arguments about the social control, how to adapt societies to automation. And that's been a feature of it, if you like. There was a really interesting paper recently by Casper Scholin looking at the fourth industrial revolution and its promotion and development and activities globally, but then also looking at how Denmark was responding to that and incorporating it in its national industrial plans and policies and so forth. And he sort of was arguing there's a sort of future essentialism around this presentation of automation as something inevitable. And there's a quote here to that effect, okay, so where he says this defines future essentialism as these discourses, narratives and visions that through different means and practices, so from historical analysis to speculative estimates to hard statistics and calculation, produce and promote an imaginary of a fixed and scripted, indeed inevitable future, and that can be desirable if harnessed in an appropriate and timely fashion, but is likewise dangerous if humanity fails to grasp its dynamics. In other words, you've got to keep up with the technological frontier, okay, and the race to remain competitive, to make use of these technologies. And so, there's a lot of momentum behind automation. I'm not denying that it's happening. I'm not trying to adopt a King Canute position here and stop the sort of tide coming in. But if you like, unlike maybe the tides, this is a consequence of the mobilization of huge investments, the production of these narratives and this future essentialism, which actually maybe risks short-circuiting important social choices in our futures and our technological futures, because automation is deliberately cast as something inevitable and desirable, destiny that demands investment. And the technological frontier is promising this productivity, control and accumulation, which are themselves sort of naturalized and not opened up. Is it a good thing that we promote further and further of capital accumulation, or that labor productivity is an unalloyed good and so forth, okay? Or that, total managerial control of environments is the best way to go in terms of sustainability. And indeed, some of these social and ecological challenges are conceived within the fourth industrial revolution discourse and things like fully automated luxury communism within a kind of automation sort of logic within these sorts of foundations. So rising inequality is seen to be best addressed by training people for the new tasks and works within tending to these automated systems. Things like universal basic income to compensate people for loss of work, and also universal services. And ecological collapse is, held off through automation delivering green technologies, better material science and control of ecosystems. Okay, so that's a very high level kind of and rapid run through sort of some of the automation sort of theory, if you like, and how it underpins arguments about our automated futures. But then when you look at more deeply and at some of the research into automation, there are questions about just how fully implemented it may actually become in practice. The technical ability to automate need not automatically lead to the its implementation at full scale and the elimination of jobs. So there's big debates and looking at estimates on how human tasks in relation to technological changes will develop in the future and what the implications of that are for how those tasks will kind of coalesce into new forms of jobs and employment. So there's a lot of work going on that, but it's certainly not clear that we're not necessarily going to see, masses and masses of jobs sort of disappearing necessarily. That actually requires a lot of, active effort to install automation more fully. There's also interesting research on what's called the kind of ghost work involved in some of these automated systems, where if you look beneath the surface, there are a lot of humans involved in cleaning and training data, fixing bugs, and managing interfaces between automated systems and uncertain or non-compliant realities of people and things and natures and so forth. And again, that relates to the first bullet point here as well in terms of some of the tasks and jobs. So, there's studies, obviously, lots of research around how digital technologies, some of the technologies are not associated with automation, are actually being used to not to displace people, but to micromanage them and discipline them much more. So, you know, around kind of platforms and gig economy work and so forth. And it's leading to kind of, you know, disorganized labor entering into work that's increasingly kind of precarious and problematic in all sorts of ways. So maybe that's an example of actually these technologies not necessarily leading to automation, but leading to quite a kind of oppressive kind of practices. And so overall, it's quite a nice paper reviewing a lot of this by Thompson last year that argues, you know, the extent to which the form and the extent to which automation may roll out will be shaped by issues of labour process, business models, and political economy, and that will shape these patterns. And so really, full automation perhaps needs political as well as economic support, and it's not simply about developing the technologies, it's how these kinds of labour processes, business models, and political economies are constructed and developed. And arguably, that's perhaps the whole point behind presenting automation in a future essentialist kind of way, you know, to kind of win those commitments and mobilize support by making automation look like an essential component for our futures. There are also questions, and you look beneath the surface, if you like, at some of the research about how fully in control automated systems will become. And this relates to, you know, largely to like ecological relations, if you like, and these ecological relations are being matters of technological control as conceived within automation. You know, and these ecologies are objects to be integrated into the total management of these cyber physical systems. They're resources, they're processes, they're sinks, and they're services, and that's how we conceive of them in relation to, you know, automated production and consumption. And the hope is that by having better control over those objects, we can manage our systems much more sustainably into over the long term. But there is, you know, empirical research that maybe cautions against such excessive instrumentality towards ecologies. You know, we're finding, as the charts on the top right of the screen illustrate, that resource efficiencies at the technology scale that some of these automated systems, you know, deliver, do not necessarily decouple impacts at the system scale of an economy or a sector. Actually, more efficient and enhanced, some of these efficiencies, these ecological efficiencies, can lead to enhanced exploitation rather than more controlled sufficiency. And so, you know, we're seeing in some of the data, or some studies are arguing that actually, although we've never really had an absolute decoupling yet from economy and environmental impacts, we've had some relative decoupling, but maybe the trends are actually even recoupling. So that relationship is a lot slipperier than some of the more self-confident arguments around automated control of ecologies. And also that, you know, maybe part of that is that these, you know, the more we research our socio-ecological systems, the more these complexities become apparent, and that these complexities can bewilder some of our, you know, very technologically sophisticated automation systems and control strategies, that these living worlds respond in dynamic and uncertain and surprising ways, and that human and non-human subjects are lively. We can escape and contradict and the kind of comprehensive calculation and control that is being sought. So maybe we need to begin, there's, you know, and some of that, Richard, leads people to talk about thinking about technologies more in terms of ethics of care rather than control, and that may actually shift the way we think about and develop technologies as well. So perhaps there's reasons for questioning some of the feature essentialism in automation. Okay, this is sort of just summing up what I've been saying, really. You know, feature essentialism is this strategy for doing, one strategy for doing technology politics, presenting a persuasive vision that can mobilize alliances and investments and programs. And perhaps actually with fourth industrial revolution, what we're seeing is actually, for all of the incredible kind of technological advances in sort of social, economic and political terms, this is sort of present tense technology, in the sense that this disruptive innovation is actually conserving and perpetuating our current economic and political sort of structures. That's what's driving and shaping automation. And that if we think about these structures and how we may transform them, then that would actually unsettle and reshape the foundations for technology development, and in which automation may play quite a different role actually, or look very, very different. And then with fully automated luxury communism, they promote this kind of acceleration of automation, and they do address questions of political economy, because they're looking for, you know, sort of socialist states and quite different relationships for taking advantage of automated systems. But there's lots of really important questions of detail, even if that is sort of feasible and to bring about, such as those in the bullet points at the bottom of the slide here. You know, when, where and how does capitalist automation transcend into some kind of communist conditions, or are we locked into automation developed under the kind of present tense, if you like? Who's going to redesign, innovate and maintain these cyber physical systems? What democratic processes will recognize and transmit society's aspirations and priorities into automation? And what about those of non-human species and our common ecologies? So there's lots of really important questions of detail that we need to address. Okay, so that's the sort of automation stuff, and this is where I'm going to move into the post-automation stuff. And intriguingly, whilst fourth industrial revolutions installed and rolling out in industrial societies, there are kind of what Adam Arvidsson in some recent work called industrial spaces within the society, where people are, out of necessity and out of idealism, engaging with technologies in quite different ways. And that's the sort of space I want to think about in the remaining few slides. Because a byproduct of this kind of industrial restructuring and relocation, including automation, is the emergence of marginalized groups who are forced or aspire to trying different approaches to technology, livelihoods, sustainability. And they include workers not absorbed into the well-paid industrial jobs, maybe service and professional jobs in the centers of design and investment in automated systems, whose work is rendered precarious, like gig economy workers, but also increasingly some of the sort of skilled tech workers that are designing and developing these systems that feel alienated or dissatisfied with their jobs in automation, or uneasy about the way these technologies are being applied. And Arvidsson characterizes this as a sort of industrious space where people turn to a different, what he calls commons-based petty production using digital technologies. Some of the elements of automation, the technologies and practices that people find to hand from, you know, the fourth industrial revolution, if you like. And they use them in the pursuit of informal livelihoods, small-scale economic activities, social innovation and entrepreneurship, hacking the technologies, and more techno-political activism. And I'll go into that in the following few slides. And this is below the radar of industrial strategy and innovation policy, and certainly not sort of, I don't really see it a lot in the kind of, you know, discourse of the fourth industrial revolution, and also not in the work on fully automated luxury communism either. But maybe attending to this very marginal space, you know, there's not a lot of social resources committed to it, but maybe actually looking and listening to what's going on there may be important for questioning the future essentialism and opening up futures to a more democratic deliberation. That's the sort of argument I want to try and present now. So with this slide, this is some of the examples we give in the paper of what's going on in these industrial spaces, okay, where some of the technologies associated with automation, like sensors, microcontrollers, digital fabrication, Internet of Things, platforms, video, software, etc. You know, even things like, you know, some of the biosciences as well. They've biohack labs, etc., are being kind of opened up and being put to quite different purposes compared to some of the fundamentals of automation that I presented earlier in terms of labor productivity, managerial control, capital accumulation. And some specific examples are work in makerspaces around commons-based peer production, for example, digital social innovation, citizen sensing projects, fixing, right to repair, and digital durability. You know, thinking about the lifetimes and of the biographies and extending them of these technologies. Techno-political platforms and platform cooperatives for coordination. And then also initiatives trying to decolonize technology and promote digital autonomy in different cultures and places around the world. And if you like, the post-automation is simply a term that we give in order to try and capture this diversity, to kind of raise make it more visible, bring it up from below the radar, if you like. Now, whether that's useful or not is up for debate, I think. But anyway, let's see. I'm coming up to the half-hour mark, so I might go through these specific examples quickly because there's a few more slides I want to say. But with commons-based peer production, I'm thinking here of things like maker spaces, hack labs, sort of community-based workshops that are open to publics, and that are networked, where people can prototype things and access digital design and fabrication technologies in combination with more traditional hand tools and prototyping materials and resources, and incubate and materialize their ideas. And, you know, we say, well, these can open up futures in different ways. They provide an infrastructure for opening up and experimenting with these technologies beyond the centers and networks of industrial design and production. A way of engaging people practically in material cultures and redistributing prototyping capabilities in societies, and actually reflecting and deliberating some of the assumptions, values and purposes to which we put technologies in modern societies. Citizen sensing, I'm sure some of you have been involved in projects like this, the use of low-cost sensors and low-power connectivity to map, sense, record and visualize environments, but perhaps in contrast to some of the impulses in automation, this is more about resignifying relationships with ecologies and making those relationships more visible rather than seeing them as objects, external objects to be controlled and internalized and exploited in productive and consumptive activity. So from controlling natures perhaps to caring about them and putting these sort of sensing capabilities to quite different purposes, and actually mobilizing communities to take action and care for matters of concern that they're sensing and mapping and representing. Okay. There's been a growth in kind of repair cafes, restart parties, projects, people encouraging people to come together and with volunteers and, you know, how to hands-on self-organized repair of devices, increasing pressure, and that's mobilizing campaigns for the right to repair, and wanting to see, you know, a revaluation of repair shops that those that still exist, and the kind of insistence on much greater kind of repair and design for longevity, durability and remanufacturing of technologies and devices. Okay, so opening up futures in those ways, through modular designs, manufacturing for reuse and repurposing, and interestingly thinking in that about, given that this is about how technologies currently get widely dispersed, then trying to figure out how to fix and repair a wide diversity of products and goods out there, if you like, may need more commons-based approaches in terms of opening up designs and instructions and making it easier to slice and splice and repurpose these sorts of technologies. So not just the practices, but also thinking about patterns of ownership and philosophies underpinning the technology, and thinking of these technologies as a commons. It's quite interesting. There are platform cooperatives and data commons. So you think of things like Uber. There are initiatives where drivers are setting up their own platforms and, using digital platforms for worker cooperatives. Platforms being used for union organizing. You get techno-political platforms for direct democracy. So most notably in cities like Barcelona and across more and more cities, designing platforms where citizens can make proposals, vote on budgets, and become much more involved in the governance of their cities and so forth. So opening up these digital platforms to different logics compared to seeing them as ways of simply coordinating and disciplining work, data assets and rent seeking, the sort of platform capitalism that people are criticizing. And these are more about embedding platforms in specific territories, rendering them accountable to users and so forth, and maybe exploring how different forms of ownership will actually shape the social consequences of these technologies. And then finally, in the examples we give, is the work on kind of decolonizing digital technologies or some of the technologies of automation. So seeking more equitable inputs and controls over design decisions, shaped by more plural cosmologies and life worlds, blending digital with traditional kind of practices in things like weaving, for example, and so forth, and thinking of frugal digital innovations. So again, opening up futures in more territorially and culturally appropriate ways, and giving voice perhaps just to groups that aren't normally present in the appropriate the design and access to these sorts of technologies. So abstracting from that, and you could probably think of other examples, we'll try to, I've got a couple more slides before I finish, to contrast, if you like, some of the sort of foundations for automation, which you can see in this slide in grey, with what are some of the recurring features, if you like, or kind of capabilities that these initiatives are opening up with relation to some of these technologies. And so this is just a very kind of simple figure to try and illustrate that, if you like, and what might be some of the sort of elements or capabilities that challenge the foundations of automation as I presented them at the beginning. Okay, and how they're informed, both the development of automation and post-automation by, social aspirations and consequences, and also how the digital affordances of these technologies are conceived, interpreted, and taken advantage of and used, if you like. And so we discuss that in this paper, we reflect on that and maybe some of the kind of risks with this, how it might be helpful, how it may not be helpful. Maybe we can enter into that in the time we'll have left for discussion. We also, this is sort of maybe this table, there's too much there for you to take in, obviously, but it's just to point out that how the things I've been talking about kind of contrast, if you like, a kind of summary of how who will be the protagonists of the future looks quite different in the fourth industrial revolution compared to fully automated luxury communism compared to post-automation. The strategies they're pursuing are quite different as well. The material basis for the future kind of overlaps, but is being taken in different directions, and how that's organized is quite different as well. And maybe the temporality is different as well. So you remember I was sort of arguing and drawing on Mike Cooley's work, how maybe there's something about the fourth industrial revolution that, for all its sort of future technological orientation, is actually quite present tense, politically, economically, and socially. So it's, the temporality might not be as advanced as it looks on the surface, perhaps. Whereas with fully automated luxury communism, it's about accelerating this and welcoming it and trying to think of counter-hegemonic strategies to win control of this technological advance and push it further in a kind of socialist sort of form. Whereas with post-automation, we're just seeing a lot of very kind of present-day subversions of some of the ingredients of automation that people find to hand, and that maybe aren't at the frontiers of the most advanced forms of automation currently. They may be smaller scale versions of earlier waves of automation. But I think the point is that these sorts of three areas of debate, activity, and discussion in conversation or in confrontation and contestation are really important for opening up futures to democratic debate and deliberation. And so we should pay attention to all of them, really. And if you like, post-automation is this term to try and bring into attention and light this heterogeneity that's happening below the radar of a lot of industrial policy and strategy debates. In terms of how post-automation is situated and might develop, and the sort of politics of post-automation, we think of that, you could think of that in terms of how do these capabilities that are there in these examples for deliberating futures and bringing them about, how might they circulate more widely? How might they go beyond the industrial space? And there might be three routes to that, if you like. One would be working with innovation institutions, okay? So connecting with institutions that promote innovations in society. The other might be aligning with social movements that seek social changes consistent with, you know, the aspiration, where these post-automation capabilities are kind of consistent with those aspirations for social change. And then the third route might be through changes in political economy. With institutions, you know, these institutions have certain power, which may tend to mean that some of the novelties emerging from this industrial space are selected and developed into commercial goods and services. And we see that through practices of open innovation, where, you know, or it may be that policy entrepreneurs in public institutions take up relevant issues like right to repair, smart citizenship, and so forth, and use them for their purposes, for reforms that aren't necessarily attuned to and fully attentive to the broader aspirations that these practitioners have in this post-automation, with these post-automation capabilities in the industrial spaces. So the politics is really about the terms of encounter with these institutions. Is it about empowering people, forming partnerships, or capture? When it comes to social movements, you know, maybe post-automation is providing capabilities for social movements to have shared aims. So, you know, data cooperatives, ecological remanufacture, and these are kind of emblematic of some of the rights and responsibilities that social movements are seeking, or some of the changes they're seeking. But also social movements, you know, work to kind of shift cultures in societies that can put indirectly, perhaps, innovation institutions under pressure over their purpose, criteria, and processes. And that may indirectly open spaces for a more empowering encounter with institutions with these post-automation capabilities. Now, obviously, with political economy, we're talking about really entrenched sort of structures, really, and how these may be transformed. So how kind of mass politics or movements within society and questions about our current political economic structures around debates about growth and post-growth, perhaps, for example, the balance and relations between capital and labour, kinds of state that we have in our societies, whether entrepreneurial or more caring, missions for technologies or decolonizing technology, and how these sort of, I know, these big questions may, it's not so much that we would build political economies around post-automation capabilities per se, but if you like, how those debates in political economy, again, may open up spaces or allow post-automation capabilities to sort of circulate and be valued and reproduced much more readily. And to what extent these practices become important for the mass politics that shape political economy and political leadership, so around dignified work, equitable prosperity, healthier colleges, and so forth. How might these practices make more sense and become more everyday if some of these kind of concerns and debates become embedded much more into our societies and economies? So that's it, Rob and everybody. Just sort of summing up, I began by, you know, automation is very powerfully situated politically and economically in our societies, increasingly so. But there's an element of future essentialism about this expansion that makes it quite programmatic. It's the politics of aligning to this automation imaginary and increasing reality. Post-automation, while on the other hand, is very marginal, but perhaps it cultivates important democratic capabilities for opening up futures. And in that sense, is a bit kind of anti-programmatic, because it's not about here's the future, come and follow it. It's about here's some capabilities for trying to explore futures. And that could be a problem, perhaps, in the sense that is it possible to kind of empower, expand these capabilities without building a kind of powerful, essentializing narrative about why they count and why they're important? So is there a bit of a dilemma there, or is it sufficient, to insist on, you know, the circulation of these capabilities for democratizing futures? And that's it. There will be a paper elaborating this stuff coming out in Futures soon, I hope. But there's also a web page that has papers and a report from a workshop we organized in November 2019, which is at the bottom there if you want to find out more. But that's where I'll stop. and I'll share the slides so you can get these links later, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen there so I can see you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Adrian. That was terrific. Very extensive overview. Well done. See some hands clapping digitally. I just going to open up the floor for questions and comments now.
Can I ask a question, Rob? It's Darren here.
Yeah, Darren, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Hi, Adrian. Thanks so much for that. That was really a very interesting and enlightening presentation. I'm grateful to you for it. I just, as you were talking, I was sort of just making, I guess, connecting the dots in my own mind and looking at how there's also, you know, a whole bunch of collective action happening, but more at the level of individual gain. I'm thinking about both the decentralized finance kind of space in terms of what's happening with various crypto movements and Dogecoin and so on, which is also a form of, you know, democratization as well, perhaps with a different motivation. And also the, what we've seen recently with Wall Street bets and GameStop and the rise of non-fungible tokens and everything else. And I heard a comment recently that the kind of, this, you know, the precarity that we see out there, which has been building for some time, has led this, you know, a number of actors to sort of try and take advantage of that volatility for their own, you know, as a strategy for survival and to try and get ahead. And so they're actually just trying to, I suppose, hack that volatility and do whatever they can to make the most of it. But it's certainly, I think, another strand in terms of what the sort of examples that you were giving. And I just thought it's more of a comment, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that as well, Adrian.
No, thanks, Darren. I think that's a really good observation, actually. And it's a nice example because it also reminds us that there can be perhaps a dark side or problematic side to some of these capabilities or practices. And maybe it's trying to think about, if you like, what underpins them to an extent. Because when you're mentioning about like cryptocurrencies that obviously operate at a tremendous scale, and it's not an area I know, so that's why it's not kind of included. All the examples we gave are ones that Mariana and I were familiar with. But I don't know, when I first sort of heard about them, I was thinking things like, you know, the whole kind of local exchange trading systems and alternative currencies at local scale that were done in a much more kind of paper-based or spreadsheet kind of way for exchanging economic activities and seen as that. And I know cryptocurrencies are something quite different, but I just mentioned the Let's one in terms of maybe some of the sort of purposes and values to which they're being put are quite different. So I think what your example there suggests to me is the importance of looking at some of these technological capabilities in relation to the kind of social values, aims and purposes which they're being put to. So you have to be a much more nuanced. And this is something that, you know, technology studies does and the sociology of technology does in a really, really sophisticated way, and that we don't go into in the paper. So I don't know, I don't have a neat, these are just reflections back, Darren. I mean, it'd be good to kind of explore that more. And the other one I thought was the growth in kind of crowdfunding as well, and that kind of, you know, individuals investing and backing people to do certain things as well. And again, how that's, I don't know, there's an interesting question here about where the norms and how this institutionalizes and the sort of how the social consequences of this stuff enters into and helps govern or shape these developments, if you like. And where maybe some of the more alarming aspects, like, you know, high energy consumption of some of these crypto mining activities or the purposes to which they're being put, how do they become regulated, if you like? So I think it's a good example, Dan. I'd have to think about it. I don't know, maybe you want to come back and...
Yeah, it's certainly a strand of inquiry I'd like to explore further, and maybe we can have a conversation about it offline. And yeah,
for sure.
Thanks, Darren. Adrian, see whether there's any other questions or comments. David, you would like to, David, and then Declan.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adrian. Super fascinating stuff. Glad I tuned in, and glad I've got the recording as well, or we access to the slides, because there's plenty to dig into there. For me, there's a couple of questions. One is that, looking at things like the evolution of the early kind of Web 2.0 into where it is now has seemed to probably be a lot of that kind of collaborative commons vibe in the early days of platforms like YouTube that has really evaporated from those platforms, and now they're much more about commercial content distribution and kind of capturing of analytics and so on, that are all driven by length of views and cache and that kind of thing. And I guess for me, are there niches that you see when you were looking at things like care economy or creative or the kind of decolonization movements that you think are like? I mean, probably that's a good example, but that you feel would survive mainstreaming without being able to get captured as say those kind of the web of 15 years ago really did get captured by essentially neoliberal capitalism?
Yeah, I think they will. I think as you kind of characterize those developments, they have been captured, aren't they? And they probably would be kind of captured again. And so, I mean, the issue with mainstreaming is more, you could think what might be the social conditions that are required for these more commons-based practices to become more widely practiced. And I think if you, as is evident in a lot of social innovation and scaling that up currently, it's sort of like, how do we almost make it into more like the kind of mainstream of business? And that tends to commodify and look for the sort of ways of monetizing some of the value in their activities, because that's how our institutions are sort of set up. And I guess that history that you've began with maybe makes us think, well, maybe actually the challenge is bigger than that. And it's actually, it's the institutions that need to kind of change if we're to enable some of these practices, if they're deemed to be desirable, to be made more robust, made more feasible amongst a wider diversity of communities and places. And that's a really big challenge, clearly. And it's probably beyond the capabilities. You know, it's not just the practitioners of these sort of marginal initiatives or these industrial spaces that can bring that about, if you like. It's a much sort of bigger political challenge, I think. There was something I was going to say as well, David, in relation to that. Oh yeah, but it may be that there are, how might that happen more kind of in a sort of piecemeal way? I think there are examples. One study, actually in the project I was working on with Rob, was looking at the things I mentioned in cities like Barcelona and Madrid, where you have these digital platforms for citizens to participate and vote and etc. And there are all sorts of issues with that, about how, you know, why people would want to participate in that way and so forth. But what was interesting about the way those platforms developed was with the technology seen as a commons and very much rooted in those sorts of territories. And that was really important, we found, for them to be able to adapt it and to try and make it meaningful for the citizens of those sorts of cities, compared to, I don't know, a kind of off-the-shelf platform that's proprietary and simply provides a consulting service. You know, we'll run a consultation exercise for your citizens, and we'll get the results, and we give you there's a decision or a report, and the city authorities can take that on board. And there's a market for that kind of, e-participation. But the fact that the technology was developed in quite a different way in these cities, I think had different consequences. So we need to think about them sort of socio-technically. And it may be that some of those sorts of advantages become widely recognized. And so, I don't know, those cities authorities that have the resources and capabilities to do things in that way, and the opportunities, may actually choose to try and think in developing their technologies in different ways that are more, I don't know, commons-based, transparent, adaptable, than simply automatically buying off the peg. So that's how you may get some marginal changes. But you're going back to your overall point, I agree. I think unless there are some kind of institutional change, unless we think more structurally, then these things are going to be marginal. I mean, having said that, they're still significant socially, because thinking about like the open innovation model, you know, I mean, it's a form of exploitation, I guess, and frustrating, but they do generate kind of ideas and practices that do mainstream. And so they're an important source of novelty and lifeblood in societies and economies as well. Trouble is that's exploiting a lot of kind of activism and voluntary labor that's not properly rewarded, I think. That diversity has a social value, and we don't, you know, it's a notional social value at the moment. I don't think as societies we invest in it appropriately. Yeah.
Thanks, David, for a really good reflection on some historical developments there. And I would like to hand over to Declan.
Thanks,
sure
thanks very much.
Right, actually, but
yeah, that's good. That's great. Yeah, look, a really fascinating discussion, and thanks, Adrian. I'd love to be, you know, thinking about this stuff over in Sussex with you at some point in the near future. And I mean, I guess that point you were just making about this relationship between city-states and these enterprises and the entrepreneurs, I guess, points to what I think is the interesting relationship between jurisdiction and, you know, these kinds of spaces that you're labeling post-automation, that they are kind of actually deeply embedded in, you know, these places where they can be fostered, I guess. I did some work on the My Data co-op in Switzerland, and was really struck by the fact that there is a kind of understanding of what a co-op is in Switzerland. You know, right down to the supermarkets, and, you know, like people kind of have an infrastructure to actually play with there, and then you can kind of create niches within that infrastructure. And, you know, that sort of speaks to your point about, you know, compensation as well. That, you know, like that is an explicit way of compensating people, you know, for their time and their for their you know, in this case for the My Data co-op for their data. So I was just wondering if you had ideas on what you're calling institutional, you know, the kind of space of institutions and its relationship with law and with jurisdiction, beyond just the city-state that you're talking about. Like how important is it to think through, I guess, legal regulations and structures as also, you know, being able to facilitate new kinds of post automation?
That's a really good question, Declan, and good to see you, by the way, and as well. And it's the big question as well. I think actually you hinted at it. I mean, I don't think there's like a neat answer. This is how, and it's almost be contradictory if I said this, okay, these are the institutional designs you need to make all of this stuff happen. And I think for two kind of reasons, maybe. One is, as you mentioned with the case of My Data in Sweden, you know, the situations and contexts are really diverse and plural. And the whole point is these institutional developments need to be appropriate to places and contexts and sort of aspirations. But maybe we need research that could at least think about the principles that you need to go about that, if you like, and they already exist. You know, maybe your work on My Data, you know, there are insights there that we can learn from. So it's sort of out there. But I don't think it would be a blueprint, you know, because that's almost like falling back into a future essentialist kind of situation. And the second point is, you know, actually, if sort of democracy is really important, again, you know, research insights, examples of institutions and issues and what people do to get around or learn to live with dilemmas, we can inform all of that. But again, it's, you know, from a democratization point of view, it's then up to citizens and stakeholders to deliberate and figure out those sorts of institutional sorts of developments. You kind of alluded to one at the end there when you mentioned like what kind of legal structures and changes. I mean, the whole intellectual property regime is a very powerful and entrenched legal structures that can be really problematic. And I wonder actually whether things like circular economy and repair and remanufacture that raise all sorts of questions about warranties an IP and the ability to kind of remanufacture, resell, repurposing, you know, what influence that may have down the line on IP, you know. And it might be illustrative how these things, you know, you might have a kind of very private property based circular economy where materials are owned, rented out and so forth, and IP's strengthened and extended and entrenched right down to almost like the molecular, well, as it is in biology, say. Or maybe there'd be an impulse that actually we need to open this up and see some of these resources as a commons. But I think that's a big one, and there's a big movement around the commons sort of currently. And then there was something else, but forgive me, I think I've lost my thread on that. So, yeah, I think, what was I going to say? It's escaped me, forgive me, everyone.
That's okay. Adrian,
Yeah.
maybe I'll jump in. One of the downsides of chairing these sessions is you get to ask any questions yourself, but I'm going to throw in one that has been going around in my mind is actually about the title. Why you decided to call it post automation, and is it post because it is something that happens after automation, or is it some kind of play on like Latour, like postmodern, and we've never been automated, or and I wonder if it actually, so it seems to be more talking about things like repurposing automation or purposeful automation. Could you articulate a little bit about why this title and whether it's appropriate?
No, thanks, Rob. I mean, it's definitely, we don't intend it in a kind of temporal sense. So it's something that comes after. Because actually also one of the influences, this was historical research I did into what's called the Lucas Plan and Movement for Socially Useful Production in the UK, well, and Northwest Europe in the 1970s and 80s, when automation was coming into manufacturing, and they were trying to argue for different ways of introducing these technologies that enhanced workers' skills rather than displace them. So these sorts of contestations have been around for as long as, you know, automation and mechanization before it, I think. But if you like, I think it's post in that second sense, in terms of what are the kind of foundations, you know, and the assumptions, if you like, and the interests that are shaping the way these technologies are used and then developed and so forth. And so it's post in that sense of like actually questioning the sort of foundations, if you like. That's what we meant it. You know, it may, in these examples and everybody's questions, there's lots of really good research and insight in all of that diversity. So part of the intent is this kind of coming up with a kind of label or trying to come up with some overarching sort of interpretation in order to engage in some of these bigger debates and arguments, and try and question some of the sort of assumption, technologically deterministic tendencies that keep coming into some of these debates and discourses, if that's sort of helpful. Or if coining a term like post-automation is just a bit of a distraction from it all, really, or not. I don't know. I'd be really interested to hear from people maybe afterwards, because I know we're running up against time, is to what extent people find this helpful or not, or problematic, you know. Yeah.
Thanks, Adrian, also for making. Got one more question. Can you try and be very brief, and also your answer, Adrian? And if people have to drop off, that's understandable as well, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Look, I can just leave it if you want to end here, no problem. Like at 6 o'clock.
No, sure. Go ahead.
Well, thanks, first of all, Adrian, for the enormously rich paper and overview given here, and the questions that we've heard. David, I thought, hit on the kind of core problematic around the expropriation of value that has a tendency to emerge from these developments. But something else that's sort of clawing away at me a bit is the kind of liberal worldview that is underpinning some of the principles and values that you advocate here around, for instance, these the democratizing kind of futures that we might see, predicated on things like citizens liberated from labor or citizen platforms. I mean, there's a question here around well, what about the politics of non-citizens, and how they figure in a very sort of material social sense in many kind of national settings, that have no kind of political agency or status within a post-automatic future, would be sort of one question I have, I guess. And then the kind of question of scale kind of haunts the kind of outlook that you sketch as well. And I think you've touched on that in a lot of ways by, shifting between these city-state kind of city initiatives that we see in Southern Europe, and the extent to which you then may kind of scale to produce something like, I don't know, transnational or transcontinental commons. There's still, I guess, a liberal kind of underpinning or logic to that kind of assumes democracy might be a pursuit, something that is desired, and what it might mean anyway. In other words, I guess I'm wondering if you can sort of cut back some of that, those elements, and how you might articulate this. Terribly long question.
And before you answer, just want to make sure you still have time as well, because obviously
I'm
commitments.
No, I'm fine. I've got a meeting in 50 minutes time, so I'm good for a while. It's the morning here, so everyone's just getting going still. And thanks, Ned. That's a really thought-provoking point, and I recognise what you're saying in how we're approaching this. I think it's a really fair comment. The scale one I'll leave, because as you say, we talked about, but this non-citizens, this sort of liberal, I wonder if a way of, I need to reflect on that. That's given me something to think about. And I can see in the way I've introduced the examples, it's just like, citizens have a right to access these things and almost sort of self-create and so forth. And maybe I gave the impression that the intent was that everyone does these practices. And I'm not sure if that's, even in the most sort of liberal of societies or liberal democratic, jurisdictions, that would ever be the case. It's rather what happens when, I don't know, 15% of a society can prototype in these ways or can engage in these activities, and in sites and places that are beyond maybe some of the centers and networks that are developing the fourth industrial revolution. And I wonder to what extent, because then that implies that, I don't know, the other 75% are not actively participating or present, and but how are they kind of impacted upon this or dealt with? So I think I see this as not almost like the tyranny of participation. It's more thinking through how politics shifts when you have quite a significant chunk of people prototyping, appropriating technology in quite different but very visible ways compared to what states and leading economic sectors are doing. But that doesn't answer your question.
I guess if I could quickly say that some of the politics, for example, around the R&D and innovation, if you like, that you see in the tech sector come out of the informal sector. This was notably the case in the Shanghai kind of cultures out of many of the China kind of underground kind of, in a sense, economies that feature migrant workers in waste industries, for instance. And this kind of value that's generated is expropriated as part of the business model of the tech sector. And this is the paradox, and I guess politics that comes with some of these kind of emergent possibilities as well.
Yeah, so then I guess the question is to address that sort of contradiction and to counter some of those expropriations, if you like, and the way that spaces that were maybe, even if, having read a bit of the research around sort of like fab labs and these maker spaces in China, some of them are seen as quite alternative spaces. But now obviously there's been, the Communist Party's had programs to open thousands of them as part of its Innovation Nation agendas, that seems to sort of expropriation. So what do people do to try and counter that, if you like? And maybe that's where, precisely that point where you get into these notions of, I don't know, non-citizens and citizenship. So yeah, I don't have a neat kind of answer there, I don't think, really. There is a question, I wonder whether there might be certain institutions or areas of, say, the state that are more porous and open to pushback or not. I mean, one of the interesting things I've noticed, and this maybe picks up on what Declan was asking and observing as well around institutions, is some of this activity in certain countries is seen and supported through like cultural institutions and cultural policies rather than economic policies. And I think that's quite interesting actually as well. And so maybe there's how these things kind of develop in that realm and become consolidated or not as sort of normal cultural practices, and that changes material culture and notions of what it means to be, I don't know, a participating member of a society and so forth. But
Adrian,
yeah,
I think I'm going to have to draw to a close. I'm also participating again at 7 in the EU Spree conference, and I need to have some dinner in between. But thank you very much for a really rich, fascinating talk. I think it's really important that more people get to hear it. So hopefully you still are agreeing to put it online, and I think yeah, really congratulations getting a paper also published in the Futures, and I'm guessing many people around here will be using it. So thanks a lot, and thanks to everyone for joining, and hopefully see you soon in real life.
Great, thanks Rob, thanks everybody, take care.
See ya.